Hi, I'm Jonathan, and I teach AP Comparative Government and US Government. During high school, I was part of a program to teach low-income kids from Hong Kong different subjects like maths and English. My partner and I made worksheets every week, and we went to a local church to teach these kids subjects that they needed to learn in school. As a club leader, I also ran classes on programming, so I know what students need to learn. I know how to design good PowerPoint presentations so that students can get the concepts clearly. I know how to structure a class so that students can learn quickly and efficiently. As an AP scholar with distinction, I took 12 APs, and so I know exactly what APs are like. I know how they're structured, I know how they're taught best, and I know how to combat the exam to get a higher score. I also got the AP International Diploma, which means that I took APs across the board. I didn't focus on one or two subjects. I didn't focus on science or math or humanities. I took a diverse portfolio of different APs. Because of this, I know exactly how they work, and had experienced a lot of different AP styles of teaching, and I also saw different course contents. Because of this, I know how to structure a course so that the exam can be easy, and I can also facilitate the love of learning. For my lesson example today, I will be talking about the UK system of government, which is a major part of US comparative government, one of the 6 countries that are focused on in the course. Hi everyone. So for my sample lesson today, I'll be discussing the UK government system. So the first thing you'll notice on this slide, if you took AP US Gov, is that instead of having 3 different branches of government, you see one big blob in the middle, and then a random Supreme Court on the right. So in the UK, everything is fused into one block. There is no separation of powers, there's no sharing of powers to different parts of government. If I show you this 10 years ago, it'll be even more different because the Supreme Court was only a recent creation. Before, there was only Parliament, and that was supreme. And so before we move into the specifics, this is a very intro lesson. And so this is something I would show in the first or second lesson, and it doesn't show a lot of in-depth things that you have to know for the AP exam. So for example, you have to know more about legislation, you have to know more about different agreements that happened in history, but this won't cover that because that's very detailed and will require studying different regions of the UK in depth. So for now, this presentation will build the foundation for what you need to know, and hopefully in future lessons, this information can come to you as I add on more details. And so the first thing we need to notice is that the UK is focused on tradition and the unwritten constitution. And so a lot of things in the UK aren't written down. So in the US, you get a constitution which makes very clear the powers of the central government and the powers of the states. In the UK, this doesn't happen. In Parliament, a lot of the rules and procedures, you can't find them anywhere. And there's been studies for centuries over what they are and what Parliament can do and cannot do. And it's all based on tradition, which results in something we call the unwritten constitution. And so legal scholars and MPs and different government officials agree that there is a UK constitution. It's just not written down in black and white. Instead, people interpret it as they like. But there are some agreed norms. For example, the Queen cannot execute someone without a trial. That's something very basic. But in reality, though, you can't find that anywhere. And so it's all based on tradition. But tradition is very powerful in the UK. And so the Queen cannot breach it and suddenly execute someone. There has to be a proper procedure. And this is similar to due process in the US. And so the first thing we should look at is Parliament, because Parliament is the central key to the UK system. The first term I want to introduce for Parliament is parliamentary sovereignty. What this means is that in the UK, Parliament is supreme. Technically, in theory, it can do anything it wants. So if Parliament wants to pass an act and basically kick someone out of the UK, it can do that. If it wants to change someone's name, it can do that. If it wants to kill someone, it could do that in theory. This is parliamentary sovereignty, meaning that Parliament can do anything it likes except for restricting itself. So Parliament cannot pass a law saying future parliaments will be restricted in any way, but it can do anything else. And so in the past, we've seen examples of people given citizenship by private acts of Parliament, so laws that only pertain to one person. And Parliament, of course, is bound by tradition. And so Parliament will not pass laws that restrict the rights of people, or it won't pass laws that randomly goes and executes different citizens. So Parliament is quite rational, but in theory, it could do whatever it likes. And there is no formal system of checks and balances like in the US to restrict this power. And so Parliament is split into two different houses, just like in the US and in different systems around the world. And this is what we call a bicameral legislature. So firstly, we see there is a House of Commons. The House of Commons is so-called the lower house, but is also the stronger house, and it takes over the main legislative role. And so just like in the US Congress, or in different countries, the House of Commons is responsible for introducing legislation and passing laws through votes. And so it is composed of 650 elected MPs from single member districts. So the UK is carved into many different constituencies, and each constituency elects one member of parliament every year, or every 5 years. And MPs stand for members of parliament. And the electoral system is a first past the post system, meaning that the person with the highest number of votes wins. So you don't need a majority, there's no sort of proportional representation, it's just the highest number of votes. That's the House of Commons. The House of Lords is something else that you don't see a lot in the world. So House of Lords is a aristocratic chamber of 798 lords, and they're split into two categories. There are the Lords Spiritual and Lords Temporal. And so the Lords Spiritual are actually Church of England bishops. So the Church of England, the Anglican Church, is the official religion of the UK. Although there is religious freedom, the state does have an official religion. And so the bishops, or the leaders of the religion, can sit in the House of Lords, in the upper chamber of Parliament. So they do have a role in passing laws and determining church policy. And the rest of the lords are called Lords Temporal. So they're appointed by the king or queen on the advice of the prime minister. And these lords are given a pass to sit in the upper chamber for their life. And so the upper chamber is completely unelected, and it does include a few people who have hereditary rights to sit. So there are about 12 lords left who have the rights to sit in the chamber passed on from their fathers or their mothers. And this is considered quite undemocratic by a lot of people, but it does still exist. The House of Lords is the weaker house, and so because of various reasons, historical reasons, because of a trend towards democracy, it has been relegated to a delaying role. And so in most cases, the House of Lords can only delay legislation by up to 1 year. And so it plays more of a role of saying, stop, let's wait and think about this, instead of stopping legislation altogether. The House of Lords used to be the stronger house, but in recent years, because of different reforms, it has become a lot weaker. And there's a part of Parliament called the King or the Queen in Parliament that is mostly ignored by a lot of different textbooks and a lot of different scholars. So in reality, the monarch of the UK, so the UK has a king or queen, and the monarch is an essential part of Parliament. So in history, Parliament used to be simply an advisory council to the king or queen, and the king or queen was the person who had the most power. Of course, nowadays, this is no longer true, and true power rests with the House of Commons. But the king or queen is still responsible for giving the royal assent. This is the same as the president signing legislation. The king or queen has to approve all laws that Parliament passes. In theory, the king or queen can reject laws and they can veto laws, but again, because of the UK's tradition and unwritten constitution, this will never happen. And if the king or queen does so, there would be a constitutional crisis, and probably the king or queen would be forced to resign. For the Parliament, all laws have to pass through both chambers, but if the House of Commons really wants something to pass and the House of Lords rejects it, they can still force it through because the House of Lords can only delay legislation. So let's move on to the next part, which is the executive branch of the UK, which is not really a branch. So in the UK, the term government doesn't refer to the entire system of governance. Instead, it refers only to the Prime Minister and his cabinet. So the Prime Minister and his cabinet are mostly drawn from the House of Commons. And the Prime Minister is the leader of the biggest party and is a member of Parliament himself. So in the UK, you don't vote directly for the Prime Minister. There's no ballot box that you can check and say, I want the next leader of the country to be this person. Instead, people vote according to party lines. So in the UK, there are two main parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And whoever wins, the leader of that party will become the prime minister, the leader of the country. And when the prime minister forms a government, he or she chooses cabinet members from amongst his fellow MPs. And these people become known as front benchers because they sit in the front bench of parliament. And cabinet members are all MPs, so they're all given one vote in parliament. And as you can see, they play a dual executive and legislative role. The cabinet and the PM are mostly drawn from the House of Commons, with very rare exceptions. So you might ask, can a prime minister be from the House of Lords? Yes, he or she can, but it hasn't happened for about a century now, because the House of Commons is the more powerful house, and because a prime minister from the House of Lords would be quite undemocratic. And so in practice today, the PM and his cabinet are mostly from the lower house. Yeah, so more details will be put into future lessons. So let's move on to devolved legislatures. So what these are is the UK is split into 4 regions: Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and England. And in recent years, each of these regions, they're actually separate countries, have been wanting more power. And so the government has responded, and they've created 3 different legislatures for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And these are the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and Northern Ireland Assembly. And so essentially, what the case is that the UK Parliament has sort of given some of the powers over to these regions, like in education and transport. This is separate from the US, and this is different because in the US, states have their own rights, and these cannot be taken away. But in the UK, in theory, the powers can be taken back at any time. So this doesn't violate parliamentary sovereignty. So Parliament passes laws that gives these powers to these legislatures. But in theory, if Parliament repeals these laws, the legislatures go away and all power goes back to the center. And in practice, they probably won't do that, but in theory, they can. So Parliament is still sovereign. And these legislatures are elected by regional voters. So that's devolved legislatures, and that's kind of a move away from the main UK system, but it's still largely the same. And lastly, we have the Supreme Court, which is sort of an outlier because it's separate from Parliament. So it consists of 12 justices chosen by a committee. They have life tenure, but they have a mandatory retirement age. So you won't see justices who are 80 or 90 like in the US. They were created by something called the Constitutional Reform Act in 2005. And what this act did was it transferred all the functions of the Supreme Court away from the House of Lords and into the court itself. And so before 2005, the House of Lords actually played the judicial role. And so if you appealed all the way to the top in the court system in the UK, you would sit before a panel of lords and they would decide your case. And this was considered to be quite undemocratic and very anachronistic, actually. And so the government fixed this by saying we'll create a separate Supreme Court that is, oh, sorry. Wait, can I redo that part, actually? Yeah, because there was a call, so yeah. Oh, sorry, I fix something on the slide as well, actually. Just give me a second. Yeah. Yeah, it's good now. So let's move on to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is sort of an outlier because it's separate from Parliament, and this is a rarity in the UK. So the Supreme Court consists of 12 justices chosen by a committee. They have life tenure, and there's a mandatory retirement age of 70 or 75. So you don't get very old justices in the UK. And the Supreme Court was only created 11 years ago with the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005. And what this did was it transferred the judicial functions from the House of Lords into the Supreme Court. And so before 2005, if you appeal to the top of the UK court system, you'll sit before a panel of lords and they'll decide your case. This was considered to be quite backwards and undemocratic because they didn't think that, Parliament should play a judicial role as well as a legislative and executive role. And so the government responded by passing a law which put all judicial powers into the Supreme Court. And so nowadays, when you appeal to the top you'll appeal to a independent Supreme Court. And some people see this as the UK moving towards a more American system of separation of powers. But again, there's a lot of conflict and debate about this. And so that's the UK system in brief. You have Parliament front and center. That's the main part of the UK. You can't do anything, you can't think about anything without thinking about Parliament. You have the devolved legislatures, Parliament giving away some of its powers to these regional assemblies, which can legislate in certain matters that Parliament decides. And you have the Supreme Court, which is an outlier and is an independent body that is the top of the UK court system. And so lastly, remember that the UK is bound only by tradition and an unwritten constitution. And tradition is very strong in the UK, but there's nothing written down. So thanks for listening, and I hope you learned something today. I hope in the future we can work together and that we can build on these basics so that you can learn more about different topics, not only the UK government, but also the US, France, different things in CompGov. I also teach US Gov, so we can also learn more in that. So thank you, and I hope this helps you with your AP exam.